Biology and Society, a teaching guide for biology departments. I presented this talk to the Oklahoma University Biology Department. And if you want to learn more about my work, you can go to Fausto-Sterling.com, or you can follow me on Twitter. I'm going to start with an injunction not to do something. Do not teach normal biology all semester and then add on 1 to 2 social issues lectures at the very end. Why not? Isn't it better than nothing? I'm going to argue that it's not better than nothing, that it's worse than nothing. This is because I believe it's disrespectful of the material, especially the social science material. Students are already moving on at the end of the semester and will not really pay attention to it in the same way. And furthermore, as a teacher, you are signaling that it's not really that central or important to the main topic. However, I do have 2 positive models to present that involve teaching the principles of biology and placing biological knowledge in social context. The first of these I call integrating, and it involves integrating social issues into an existing course. The example I'll offer tonight is comparative vertebrate embryology, a course I taught for a number of years at Brown University. The second approach is dedicating, designing a new dedicated course. My example here is a course I developed also at Brown entitled The Biology of Gender. Let me start with a few notes on process. First, as you're deciding what course to teach and working on it, you need to think for yourself and discuss with your colleagues, where does the course fit in the curriculum? For example, can it count towards a major? And if not, why not? Which students would you expect to take the course? For example, if you're only expecting non-majors to take the course, what is that saying to your majors about how important it is to have the topic of biology learned within a social context? And finally, can it substitute for an existing standard course? That is, can the course, as mine did, the Biology of Gender, substitute for an introductory level course in biology that's more standard in format? Also, a few notes on content. It will really help if you start by asking, what are the big picture biology concepts that students should take away? If you do this, it will help you focus on what to include and what you can cut out because it gets too long, because there's always so much that we want to say. Similarly, what are the big picture society concepts that students should take away? Does the course offer a theory? And finally, does the course offer a theory of science that supports the idea that biology and science are mutually interwoven? This is important because the standard thinking about science is that it's something apart from society. So if you're breaking that rule and saying, here's a course in which it's integrated into society, you need to have a good reason why it's important to break that rule and why maybe you think all teaching should be done that way. Let me start then with the first course, in which I took the topic comparative vertebrate embryology, a course I had taught in a very conventional way for any number of years, and integrated it into and integrated social issues into this course. Let me offer you first the basic syllabus. And what you can see here is a fairly standard syllabus in which I introduced topics. There was reading and films that went with each lecture. There was lab discussion and reading, and then there were due dates for student web projects, which I will talk about further. But of course, there was a course introduction, and we start, as we always do, with a course in embryology talking about fertilization, cleavage and cell division, germ layer formation, and so forth, neuralation and axis formation, and on to extraembryonic membranes, placentation, etc. So in terms of organization, a pretty conventional course, except, as you'll see, we made basically 3 important structural changes to it to integrate social issues into it. So looking under the hood to look at what these three things were, I first presented what I think are the big ideas of biology that the course will cover. So what are the big concepts that students should have nailed by the end of the semester? The second is that throughout the semester, I used something that I designed called knowledge webs, in which I showed how the particular science that we were talking about integrated into a whole web of social issues that required discussion and also fed back onto the science. And then lastly, I invented a kind of student project, a writing project that I called a web project, because in fact, I had groups of students design websites that did some of the same things I did on the topics I lectured on, but on topics of their choosing. And these websites were then available for others to use. So what were the big questions? The big concepts were morphogenesis, how do animals take shape from a single-celled organism, the fertilized egg, to something as complicated as a human being or a fish or a chick. What are the elements involved in growth, which is somewhat different from shape changing, it's just increase in cell number. Reproduction, how does fertilization occur? How does ovulation occur? And sperm formation, how does that lead to fertilization? How do you get from fertilization to implantation to the formation of all of the different body parts? Evolution, always a key concept in any biology course, is critical here in terms of the comparative part of the course. So why does a fish egg look different from a chick egg? How does a chick egg compare to a human egg? So what is it that leads to the evolution of these different kinds of morphogenesis, these different forms of development? And then finally, environmental integration, which is related to evolution, because a chick egg has different demands made on it because it's an egg that's laid on land out of water compared to, say, a fish egg, which is laid in water, or a mammalian egg, which is again in an aqueous environment, but it didn't evolve directly from fish to mammal, but rather it evolved from fish to bird to mammal. And so how does then the mammalian embryo integrate into the uterine environment? In the opening lecture of this course, I offer my first approach at a knowledge networks map, the co-production of the social and scientific, starting with the course itself, which will focus on embryology today. But how did we get to embryology today? We did so partly by how could we even learn how to see the embryo? Well, that had something to do with industrial development, because as industries developed, they developed certain kinds of technologies which then found themselves in their way into basic science. For embryology, the comparative embryology that we studied, a very basic one was the development of aniline dyes, which enabled scientists to stain cells, stain thin slices of embryos where the nuclei and the cytoplasm stained different colors, so that they could actually make slides of thin slices and study the serial sections under the microscope. Various kinds of scientific practice, certain kinds of demands for precise experimentation. The history of the field in general obviously contributed to embryology today, and the history of the field is in itself influenced by the early explorations and scientific discoveries, which led to the ability to make comparisons between different animals, because as Europeans traveled for colonial purposes throughout the rest of the world, as they were busy colonizing the world, they were also collecting what seemed to them strange specimens, which they brought back to Central European capitals, where they became objects of scientific study. So colonial and racial exploitation, and also exploitation of distant natural worlds, contributed to the development of the history of the field. So it's these kinds of connections that a knowledge networks map um, points out and enables a student to see how the particular topic that they're studying is in fact embedded and meshed in a much broader set of topics. Let me give you an example of a few other knowledge webs. First, for example, when I lecture on fertilization, I talk about the basic biology of it: gamete contact, regulation of sperm entry, egg-sperm nuclear fusion, activation of egg metabolism. And I point out that these also, the discovery of these things are related to the history of the field. There's a huge older debate about what was important in the embryo. Was it the ovum that was the key to development? Was it the sperm that was the key to development? And you had warring groups of people called ovists and spermists who argued back and forth, often on religious grounds, as to what was important for fertilization. In more modern terms, what we know about these aspects of fertilization lead to knowledge about contraception and the development of new contraceptives. So contraception itself, both how it works physiologically, what its issues are in terms of religion. You could have this go off into a discussion of religion and contraception. This could go off into a discussion of medical care and health policy and contraception, and so forth. You have in vitro fertilization, and then some interesting biological things that relate to fertilization, one in particular called parental imprinting. And I left this web open because you can see or imagine how it continues to sort of spread out, splay out into the world. Another example that I call the Neuralation web starts with the central biology question, the neural tube. What are the mechanics of how it forms, and what are the genetics involved with it? And the neural tube, for those of you who have not had an embryology course, is the basis. The formation of the neural tube is the basic structure that leads to the development of the central nervous system, or the brain and spinal cord. So again, you have all of these different things that might be related to it. You have neural tube defects, for example, and how they form, the mechanisms that they form, are sometimes can be related to the epidemiology of race, class, ethnicity, gender, pollution, diet. These are all related. These are all related to neural tube defects. Who's more likely to get them? Who's less likely? The question of, if you have a diagnosed neural tube defect, do you get an abortion? That leads to a whole other set of questions, which are both social and religious in nature. If you choose not to get an abortion, but to give birth to a child who is disabled in some fashion, that leads to a whole question of healthcare policy. Who's responsible for the disabled? Does that choice fall only on the family, and then often primarily on the mother in the family? So there's a gender aspect to it. There's a whole series of ways this Neuralation web gets extremely complex. But again, you see that the main topic in the course is linked to a whole bunch of other things, some of which are more biological, some of which are more social. So the pedagogical goal of such course is not to teach particular bits of knowledge that constitute the subject matter in a traditional way. Instead, it is to encourage students to see that knowledge fits within a broader web of knowledge. To achieve this goal, I introduced some non-traditional material into the lectures and into assigned readings. But I also want students actively involved in conceptualizing the web of knowledge in which embryology is enmeshed. And so to do this, to this end, I also conceived of the third component, a new form of writing assignment that I called web expansion units. The general concept of the web projects are the following: is that particular knowledge about embryos emphasized exists within a larger web of knowledge. That larger web of knowledge affects how we understand particular bits of interest to us. It influences how we interpret and make theories about that knowledge. and it affects which bits of knowledge are deemed important in the broader society. It affects how society supports the development of new knowledge. Specifically, these web expansion units are hypertext expansions of the course syllabus. An expansion topic may be primarily scientific, that is, discussing a hot new finding or a relevant scientific topic for which time does not permit in-class coverage. It may be historical, discussing an historical aspect of a particular topic. It may be clinical or applied, discussing a medical or social application or component of a topic. It may be philosophical or ethical, discussion of ethical and philosophical dilemmas relevant to a discussed topic, or it might be socioeconomic, discussion of the social, economic, and or policy aspects of a course component. Each is to be done as a group project with 3 to 4 people per group. I think this is important because, in fact, science itself is usually done in groups. It's not done by a lone individual genius. That's a model from the 18th century. And the sooner we pedagogically teach our students to work in collaborative groups towards specific sort of multi-purpose ends, the better off our students will be carrying on this notion of collaboration into the world. So in terms of content, regardless of the main focus, the expansion unit, I said, must relate to the scientific content of the course. Thus, even when addressing an ethical question, the website must contain a clear account of the science involved. Similarly, even if primarily discussing a scientific issue, for example, the effects of folic acid on neural tube development, the website should address the social context in which the science is embedded, for example, poverty and maternal nutrition. I made a number of very specific requirements so that the quality of the web produced is both academically good and visually and otherwise interesting. So I suggested, because I want students to know what a library is. These days, so much can be done without ever setting foot in the library. I said that students must use both print and web sources. And by print sources, I meant books and original academic articles. All claims must be documented and backed up with footnoted resources. So it's like a writing paper in this sense. We want to teach footnoting and documentation. I also want students to evaluate their sources. And evaluating websites was a fairly new art. I asked them to learn more about how to do this by following sources on the given page. I'm sorry, by following sources that I gave them on a page on my website called Additional Information. This I actually got from librarians who have published ways to adequately document your website. So I asked them to look at when the website was published. Was it a publication from a high school student or a qualified academician? Was it someone touting a particular point of view, say a pharmaceutical company trying to sell its pharmaceuticals? In other words, to figure out how to evaluate the quality of the knowledge that they were getting off the websites that they used. I asked them to include hyperlinks to a few good websites. Briefly, I asked them to annotate these. What is the site good for? Who produced it? And why? And that's for the use of anybody who comes to their website and wants to follow up further. I asked that they include at least 1 to 2 graphic representations. I noted that they had to cite the source of the graphic, so they couldn't just nab a graphic anywhere on the website and plop it in. And as I said, no pictures without representation. And I also gave them issues of copyright on a separate piece of, or a separate link to my website. And again, they could check with librarians about how to use copyright. Then they needed to ask themselves, is our site a good jumping off point for delving more deeply into the subject? And if their additional sources include key books, articles, and websites arranged topically, the answer might well be yes. So finally, I wanted to make sure the project looks and flows like a whole piece rather than 3 or 4 independent but slightly linked efforts. Collaboration, I noted, is essential, and I did note remind them that they all get the same grade. So they all floated together or sunk together. And mostly, I have to say, they floated. They did beautiful jobs. Here are some ideas that I put out as I was trying to help them think about it early in the semester. After, along with each lecture, I listed some possible expansion units, and I'll just give you a quick example of that. For example, in the lecture, let me just choose one. In the lecture on neuralation and axis formation, I asked them who was Hilda Mangold, an important historical figure, a woman who did not receive the credit she should have for discovering something called embryonic induction. I suggested that they might address a question called that we discussed briefly: should anencephalic babies be used as organ donors? I asked them, I mentioned this before, what public health measures might best prevent spina bifida, these kinds of things. Under reproductive technology, I was like, who has access to reproductive technology? Why not adopt instead of going to huge expense and physiological stress to make your own genetic baby? What is cloning, and is it good or bad? And can we use reproductive technology to change the human race? That is it simply eugenics in modern dress? That's the kind of thing that that I put after each lecture. So what did they choose to do? They, in one class, there were 7 projects. One group looked at cleft lip and palate, another congenital heart disease, another fetal alcohol syndrome. I'm going to show you the one that that looked at conjoined twins. This is a little hard to see on the screen, but this is their opening page, and it would have looked better in the original, but it's hard to save and store these older technologies. Anyway, with conjoined twins, they could start with looking at history. You could jump to a history page, an ethics page, a science page, works cited, and then further information. I'm going to start with the science page, in which they introduce the home science page. They introduce the classification. What are conjoined twins, for example, is the main thing that they use. Where are conjoined twins connected? Another part of it. Or if you go back to, sorry, I should go back to science. The etiology of it. How are conjoined twins formed? They go into that. Why does an embryo sometimes split? They discuss that. They asked a really interesting question: can conjoined twins be of opposite genders? How often are they born? That's the basic idea in the science. And they asked some important ethical questions in how do you separate conjoined twins? What about surgeries that are sacrifice surgeries, that is, in which there's only one heart but 2 brains? How do you separate those? How do you decide which brain lives and which brain dies? And then this is hyperlinked. It says click here for more on this issue, and so forth. So this is an example of a really nice job that this group of students did. And you can see it works like a website with lots of hyperlinks and addresses a whole web of issues. Let me move now to what I call the dedicated course and talk to you about the biology of gender, a course I developed as an alternative to an introduction to biology. I'm going to talk less about this because the time is getting late, but let me show you first the syllabus. And this is hard to read, but what I want you to see on it, and I will read it for you, is that we start with the basic course introduction. There's readings. I did introduce a lab in this, a brief lab, and I'm trying to see if I can magnify it, but I can't with this format. And I start with an introduction, ask questions such as what is sex, defining sex and gender, the evolution of diversity is another topic. The evolution of diversity, I went on for a couple of sessions on that. And in each case, we're using readings, which are some of them conventional biology readings and some of them readings from gender studies or other areas of interest. And we go on like this in terms of the basic aspects of cell division, fertilization, and then hormones and biosynthetic pathways, but focused on hormones, using, for example, when we talk about biosynthetic pathways and hormone biosynthesis, I choose from there examples of disruptions of hormone biosynthesis that lead to the birth of intersex, which leads us into a whole discussion of intersex children and how they should be raised and treated medically, and so forth. So in terms of the biology, there's the basic notions of sex, gender, human evolution, cell division, hormone biosynthetic pathways. It's all in here, which would all be in a normal biology course. But in addition, I have put in, I have couched this in terms of the topic of gender, which is a question that was of great interest to the students who took it. And I think that I actually encouraged people to take the course who would not have taken a basic intro bio course if it had been just generally about the same topics, but without a focus on gender. Finally, I want to close by saying, if you're trying to do something like this, where would you look for ideas? Even this morning, I read the journal Science and the journal Nature every week, and they always have interesting news items. So this morning I was reading Science, and in it was a little news item about a new course that was developed called Beyond Green Chemistry, Teaching Social Justice in Organic Chemistry. Well, if you're an organic chemist or a chemist, this would be of great interest, and you could go look up in the Journal of Chemical Education and see what this particular teaching team did in order to teach organic chemistry in terms of teaching social justice. So this is more a dedicated course, just as I chose gender in order to teach principles of biology. This group chose social justice as a way to as part of the way to teach organic chemistry. And there was there's a blog that I found at the same time called Social Justice Centered Science Teaching and Learning, and I've included a link to that blog. And then I decided just to do a little bit of Googling, and I suggest that you can also look at science education journals. There are a lot of these. I've chosen ones for biology. There's the American Biology Teacher, Advances in Physiology Education, Bioscience Education, and so forth. And all of these journals publish articles on how to develop courses of different kinds. And some of these would be courses that look at social issues in biology. So there are actually a lot of contemporary resources out there, and it's something that I think can be done. Not only that, I actually think it's something that should be done, because I don't believe that science is something apart from the social world. And I think we are misleading students when we teach it as something separate. There are a lot of technical issues to deal with in terms of especially at the upper level, how to teach maybe a lot of the techniques or technicalities that we want advanced students to know. But we can do that It can be done. And I would myself argue that we see a complete revision of the science education, of the science curriculum in all fields, so that it was taught more embedded into the social structure that we all live in. Thanks so much for coming to this class and for listening to this YouTube presentation.